Hey everybody, my name is Pastor Raphael, and today I'm going to be talking about the book of Acts. The book of Acts was written by Luke, which is the same author for the Gospel of Luke, and it was written for Theophilus, specifically as it states in the books. The book of Acts is the historical story of how the Christian church began in the early church history, and it could be broken down basically into four separate sections. You have the introduction, which is when Jesus is still with us, instructing the disciples after his resurrection about the Holy Spirit that's coming, then how the Christian gospel got spread throughout Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and then throughout the ends of the world. So we're going to begin with the introduction, where Jesus is with us, and this after Easter Sunday, while Jesus is with us back on earth in human form for 40 days with his disciples, still giving them some final instructions, and he tells them to stay in Jerusalem so that they could receive the Holy Spirit, which will empower them to then be able to go out to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the world to spread the gospel and the good news of what Jesus did. Beginning in chapter 2, we start seeing, and chapter 2 is when the day of Pentecost, all the disciples were together waiting for this Holy Spirit to fall. And it was on the day of Pentecost, once all the Jewish pilgrims from all over the world were coming into Jerusalem for the pilgrimage for the Feast of Pentecost. Now during this time, the Holy Spirit came on the disciples like a rushing wind, and they began to speak in other languages that they didn't know, but the pilgrims recognized that they were speaking their languages. And this is what causes the beginning of the Christian movement. Peter starts preaching to them. 3,000 people are saved on this day. And Peter then continues to preach over in the Jewish temples. And as the church continues to grow, they need to get more leaders so that they can continue to minister to these new Christian believers as to what's going on. And this is where we get Stephen. And Stephen starts preaching in the temples as well. And he gets persecuted by the Jewish leadership. Eventually, he gets stoned to death. And the stoning of Stephen is what causes the Jews to scatter from Jerusalem, and it begins the spread of the gospel to Judea and Samaria, which were the neighboring countries. That's where Philip starts preaching to the Samaritans, which is the sworn enemies of the Jewish people at this time. And it was also during this time frame where Saul has his road to Damascus experience and has his face-to-face encounter with Jesus and becomes a Christian and becomes an ambassador for Christ as well. And he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles ultimately. Now, during the second section of the book of Acts, we see where this is where Peter has the vision of the unclean animals, and God tells him to eat of them. And Peter tells him, I cannot eat of anything that's unclean, for it's against the Jewish law. And God basically chastises Peter of saying, how dare you say that anything that I have made clean is unclean? And it was this vision and this action that Peter then spoke and preached to Romans and other Gentiles, and they became saved, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit as well. And that action solidified that the gospel isn't just for the Jewish people, but it was also for all of God's people. It's the day of Pentecost, is when God was trying to bring back together everything from the Tower of Babel, and Jesus bringing everybody back home to be where they belong, which is saved through Christ. After this encounter and the spreading of the Gentiles, then Paul takes over. The second half of the book of Acts is basically the story and the journey of Paul. Paul went through 3 main mission journeys. First to Jerusalem to start preaching the gospel there, and then on to other nations to spread the gospel to the Gentiles. And the book of Acts ends pretty abruptly in Rome with Paul's imprisonment in Rome. And I think the reason why it ends pretty abruptly is because the book of Acts is a continuing acts of the apostles and disciples of Jesus Christ. You and I are disciples and apostles of Jesus Christ. So we have Acts chapter 29, which isn't in the Bible, but it's just a continuation of what it was in the early church. So I just pray that we continue to look at the book of Acts as guidance as to what it is that we should be doing and what it is that God wants us to do, so as we get the boldness of the Holy Spirit to be able to spread the word and continue forward. I thank you all.